For me, what I've learnt over the years is to understand and be able to communicate to all of the people I work with, particularly people in the team, what their connection is to what makes the organisation tick. Work-life balance, we often think about that as being time, money and actions, but my conclusion is it's much more about how we think and feel. And so in that way, I think I've got a really good work-life balance because I think I have a really healthy perspective on work and life. And that doesn't mean things in my work and life are both perfect or even great. But what it means is I think I have a healthy attitude to them.
Hi, I'm your host Chris Matthews, and you're listening to the Mentor Collective podcast. Conversations that resonate, stories that inspire. In each episode, I'm joined by a guest. We explore their personal stories, the challenges and triumphs which have shaped them, and the invaluable lessons learnt along the way. Join us as we navigate through 4 key themes: career journey and reflections, personal and holistic approach, leadership and values, and finally, mentorship, guiding and being guided. In each theme, we traverse the past, present, and future, unraveling the unique narratives of our guests. Welcome to the Mentor Collective podcast. Penny, it's so nice to have you on the podcast. Thank you so much for joining. Could you give us a little intro to who you are, please?
Yeah, thanks so much for inviting me, Chris. So you and I have worked together on a few projects over the years. That was while I was COO at Presido, who are a Salesforce consultancy. And I've been in the Salesforce ecosystem for about 17 years now. And I've worked in lots of different roles in this space. So I've worked leading projects for end users. I've worked for a big app company, Conga. I've been an independent contractor. I've worked for smaller implementation partners and massive GSIs like Cognizant and IBM. So I've got quite a big range of experience, but for me, that was also a kind of a second career. I'd already done about 10 years in the financial services industry, and a couple of years before that sort of finding my feet in the world of work. So I'm at that point in my career where I think Salesforce is going to dominate what I do for the next few years, but I also kind of hope that I'm going to do something else before I retire as well. So
thank you. So our first theme is career journey and reflections. And it sounds like there's a lot of career there to get into. So I wondered if you could share with us, how did your journey in the industry begin and what led you to where you are today?
So I'd say that my career journey is pretty unconventional. And so for anybody listening, I think that there's probably good and bad things about that. I think there's a lot of pressure on people to kind of map out what their career is going to be and to figure out where they want to be in 5 years' time or 10 years' time, and to, especially in bigger organisations, to work through promotion processes and keep going and keep going. And while I think that that suits a lot of people, it can also be a bit demoralising for people who don't feel like they're succeeding in that environment. And so for me, my career journey has been less like that and more like a game of Frogger, really, of just sort of leaping from one lily pad to then a log that's floating down the river and then the next lily pad and going along. And it's that, I think, reflects the fact that actually, while a lot of organisations try and push us into these linear careers, life isn't really like that. So I think especially for people these days, where you live, who you're living with, where you need to live to be able to afford to live somewhere, where your kids are, where your parents need, where you want to have adventures, where you want to travel to, those are quite incompatible with that kind of linear career. And certainly the way my life has gone has meant that my decisions about my career have been informed as much about what else was going on in my life as they were about where I wanted to go for my career. And I think that's also particularly common among women, where we do have to make typically more compromises around what we do. So yeah, I started out leaving school, kind of didn't quite finish my A levels at school, got a job working for a voluntary organisation that I'd been a part of for a few years. And then when that came to an end, it was a 1-year contract. I'd found a couple of other jobs, and then one thing led to another and another job. And connected with that was trying to move away from Devon, where I'd grown up, and worked initially towards Bristol and then towards London. And then after doing that for about 3 or 4 years, I decided that actually I did want to get a degree. And so then I fitted work around study and study around work, as you do for a while. And then by the time I finished my degree, I was starting my own business with a colleague that was in the insurance industry. So we were providing services to insurance companies. And I was very young to be getting involved in starting my own business, probably far too young, and didn't know what I was doing. But that was really fun for a couple of years. I continued studying at the same time, but then I also had my baby. So I went straight back to work after having her. And then we were lucky enough to be able to sell our business a couple of years after I had the baby. So I used the money we got from the sale to be able to spend some time at home with her when she was a toddler. But that meant that after 18 months or so of being at home, I needed to restart my career. And that was incredibly difficult. I was about 30 and I'd had 12 years work experience. But because it was this kind of unconventional background, it was quite difficult to know how to describe myself on my CV and to recruiters to find a new role. And at that point, that's when I joined the Carbon Trust, which was then where I was first introduced to Salesforce. And for probably about the next 3 or 4 years, my work life straddled subject matter expert kind of sales leadership with knowledge of Salesforce. After 3 or 4 years, then I really kind of doubled down on the Salesforce. And since that time, that's really what's driven my career. And since then, it's been a bit more structured as to how I've grown in my career. But equally, I hope this will resonate with people. It's not a simple question of just getting promoted. It's also about getting different types of experience and seeing different kinds of organisations and wanting to be involved in different sorts of projects that have meant sometimes I've made sideways moves. And I'm kind of really relaxed about doing that.
It's really great. Thank you for being so open and thorough, because I think that there's a lot in there which I hope we can unpack over the next little while. And maybe the first thing I'd like to unpack with you is, I think it was maybe even the first thing you said, or maybe the second thing, about a sense of pressure associated with mapping out a career or a person's career. I think you said something along the lines of a lot of people feel pressured to have goals and to have a plan for their career and to stick to that in some way. I think some people would start their career with a map and some people not. When they do, there's for sure a pressure to kind of stick to that map and to only focus on that map. But I think if you don't have a map, then you can be more skill-led, you can be more interest-led and passion-led. Which side of the fence would you say that you've been more on through your career?
I definitely have fallen on the side of being reactive in growing my career rather than planned. I think that planning anything is really great when everything goes to plan. But it can also be a real pressure. It can also be a trap. And the same is true for being reactive and responsive. You can find yourself kind of trapped in a job or in a situation that you wonder, how on earth did I end up here? I think the difference is that if you've got there because you've been responding to circumstances, you can always understand why you ended up there, what was good about that decision, and it gives you confidence about change. And I know it's a real truism, that old Darwin quote about how it's not the strongest but the most adaptive species that will survive. But I think that's very true. So when I find myself in a situation that isn't working in some way, or where I have an opportunity to either stay or go, I don't have any fear about change, because I've changed so much. Doesn't bother me. So I can take the risk. Whereas somebody else that's maybe worked in the same organisation their entire career, they've been fixed on a linear path, being faced with change is much more frightening. And that can cause paralysis. That means that then people who had a plan are then not necessarily making the best decisions anymore because of how things have worked out for them. So I'm definitely more on the reactive side. I don't know that there is anything that's better or worse between being really well planned and really reactive. I think it's going to be about who you are as a person and what else is going on in your life. Because if you have a great plan, then if you're not hitting your markers on that plan, I've seen a lot of people really beat themselves up, and it becomes then a self-fulfilling prophecy. The worse their confidence gets because they're not hitting their markers, the less likely they are to achieve those markers because their confidence is knocked. Or other people who have less of a plan and more of a goal or an aspiration, and then find themselves assuming that a pathway is going to get them there, only to find out later it kind of didn't work like that. Or, the whole idea that if they work hard and they do well, that's going to be enough to be successful, and then finding out actually playing politics really well and having some good luck and having somebody that supports you is more important, in fact. And so there are lots of pros and cons, whereas being reactive obviously means that you're going to take a lot more risks. You're going to go backwards as well as forwards sometimes, and it's more difficult to achieve that end goal because you're often competing against these people who've got linear careers. But haven't we all seen that thing where somebody comes in new to an organisation, more senior, paid more than somebody that's been working there diligently for 5 or 6 years? And I don't know that that's the right thing, but that is the world that we live in. So for me, I try to be open-minded to all of those possibilities and look at jobs and my career in the round, connect them up to how much money do I need to earn, where do I want to live, what's my family situation right now, what else is going on in my life, what flexibility do I want, and I'm making work decisions founded in all of that, and a lot to do with what gives me pleasure at work, what gives me joy versus what do I find really frustrating and difficult, because I know that I'm better off doing something that I enjoy in an environment where I feel like I can be successful than doing something that I enjoy far less. Actually, even if theoretically that was going to be more senior or paid more, it wouldn't work long term because the frustration it would cause would mean it just wasn't going to be successful for me.
Yeah, and I thank you so much. It seems to be a recurring theme across people that I speak with on these podcasts of a kind of sense of personal autonomy and ownership of your own decisions and career as a result. And what I really liked about what you were talking about earlier was this idea of opportunities to stay or go. And where I hear that as being a kind of someone might come with a job opportunity, and that is an opportunity to stay where you are or to go to this new place. And what I'm hearing in between what you're saying and tying in with some of the other people I've spoken to is the importance of being able to say no based on what you really want. And I'm hearing as well in what you're saying, and I'm thinking about people that I've worked with as well who have accepted the promotion, whether that's internally or externally, because it's just a promotion and it's the kind of the checkbox, and it's a kind of what they think is maybe an objective measure of success, but is actually maybe pulling them in a different direction, maybe to what they ordinarily might want. What I'd be really interested to ask you is whether you've had opportunities, or if you could share with us whether there have been a few opportunities you've had which have just clearly been the wrong fit, and you've thought, actually, no, that is yes, it's more money, yes, it's more whatever it is, but actually it doesn't feed into my passions, it doesn't feed into what I might enjoy. And for sure, like, not everyone is passionate about what they do, but you can enjoy it whilst not being passionate, right? So do you have any kind of experiences of that?
Yeah, probably several, really, Chris, because I agree with you. It's very easy to make decisions for the wrong reasons, I guess. And so something like title or level or status, those don't actually mean anything, really. Like, we're conditioned to believe that those mean something, but they don't. They're irrelevant. Money, that definitely has meaning, right? And I think for all of us, there are times when we need to make the decision based on money. And there have been times in my life where having, an extra $3,000 on my base salary for a year was reason enough to take a job. And that's a totally legitimate way to make a decision. But then what you need to do is to remember that and hold on to that, so that when you're making the next decision, you've got that for context. Because sometimes people make those decisions, they make them kind of really rationally and tactically, and then after a year or two of being in the organization, they kind of get so swept up in what's going on and their sense of levels and promotions and blah blah, they forget that was what their decision making was in the first place. And then that's what I mean about falling into traps. But for me, there have definitely been jobs I've taken for the right reasons, where for what I must have just not done my due diligence properly. And I don't want to name any, but there have been a couple of jobs that I've taken. One of them I knew on day one. This was quite a long time ago now, probably 18, 19 years ago. Day one, I took the job and I just knew it was a bad decision. I knew straight away, oh God, this is not going to be the job for me. And what were those things that meant it wasn't right? I think while it was private sector, there was almost an atmosphere of public sector about it, or at least our kind of stereotypes about public sector. And so how do you feel about that? What do you experience? So lots of people, lack of clarity about roles and responsibilities, poor connection between what each person is doing in their job and how that feeds into the organisation's success. And for me, what I've learnt over the years is that's quite critical for me, is to understand and be able to communicate to all of the people I work with, particularly people in the team, what their connection is to what makes the organisation tick. And when you lose that, I find that very, very demoralising. When what I'm doing to my idea of common sense is either irrelevant to, or perhaps even contradicting with, the purpose of the organisation. Or where I'm looking around me, and I've done this in several organisations, and thought, right, so we could just make 70% of the people here redundant and the organisation's efficiency would improve. Why on earth am I the only person looking around me and thinking this about this place? Because in bigger organisations particularly, you end up with this kind of busy work culture where people are so busy running around with their laptops, having meetings about meetings about meetings, that there's such a culture of the importance of being busy that becomes such a value. And more than status, more than job title, more than money, it's about, I'm busier than you. No, I'm definitely busier than you. And when you get to a culture that values busyness like that, that to me is a major red flag. And I've worked for a couple of places over the years where it's like that. And I feel you could take a person out of that organisation and you'd be able to see that they're not fulfilled, they're not happy, they've actually got quite a lot of anxiety, because this puts a lot of pressure on people. We hear a lot about the 24/7 always available. And you know what? Being 24/7 always available is a real buzz if you're the Prime Minister, or if you're the CEO of a major corporation, or if you're doing something really important. That's a good thing, and you can enjoy that availability. When that 24/7 availability comes out of this kind of culture about this competitive busyness, it's just incredibly draining and demoralizing, because you're not getting any of the fulfillment, because fundamentally it's not real work and it's never going to fulfill you. And there's a kind of fakery about that means that people are hurting in those situations. And what often goes along with a culture like that is a kind of fake positivity. Everything's amazing. And when you start putting all of that together on people, it does become quite painful. And then you have that whole culture of everybody's in it together. Nobody actually wants to address that problem. And I've worked for a couple of organisations like that over the years, and I've also left organisations at a point where I can see that's where they're going. That's what it's getting to. There's a bit of emperor's new clothes in those scenarios, usually, where the culture is all rah, 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 we're the best. And as soon as that becomes something that everybody has to do, it becomes performative. That means it's valueless now. And I find those kind of places very, very difficult to spend any time in. I find them quite damaging to me. And yet it's an incredibly common way of working and being, I think.
It's really interesting, because I completely share the same perspective of you on everything you said, and I've been diligently writing notes. I want to come back to almost too many things. But I had a really interesting conversation with an American colleague, and as you and I work in generally quite US culture dominated spaces, or maybe have done, at least where we've shared some work. And I was lucky to have this conversation with a quite an open-minded American person who's quite well traveled and understands a little bit about our British culture, which is maybe more stoic and self-critical and less rah-rah. And I was saying to them, like, why is it that everyone is just so in love with their company, and it's family, and it's this and it's that, but then in a month they're gone, and then they're talking about, oh, I love my new family, and it's great, and it's this and it's that. And their response was, well, wouldn't you be the same if you could be fired today, right now? And the sense of job security is so much less. And I had never thought about that perspective before. And, unfortunately, it was almost kind of prophetic. It wasn't that person, but a number of people in that same organization were let go on the day. But that was a really interesting perspective, I think, from someone in that kind of culture. Maybe that's one of the things that we have in Europe that they don't have so much in the US, is more of a kind of right almost to not have to perform in such a heavy-handed way to demonstrate allegiance, which, as you say, is fickle.
Yeah, go ahead,
I think that's one reason that comes about. But I think the fundamental why as a leader would you create a culture like that? And it comes from a place of weakness. It's a lack of confidence. It's a way of compensating for something else, because actually all of that stuff, none of that helps you make more money or be more successful in whatever you're doing, which is why for me in cultures like that, my mind often goes to the public sector, because you have the same thing there. One of the things I like about the private sector really is you have that clarity, right? Our job is to make money. And, politically, I might have different views about the world or whatever, but I kind of like that simplicity, right? Because ultimately you're going to look at the books, and unless there's some sort of fraud going on, it's very clear, either we made money or we didn't make money, and this is what we're going to do with the money that we made. And I love how cut and dried and how basic that is. And that's what all of our organisations exist to do. That gets far more complex when you're listed, even if you're on AIM or wherever you are, because then actually where your value comes from is derived by different things, really, rather than how you make money. Similarly, we've all seen the tech businesses and the various bubbles that we've had where, just look at WeWork as an example for ridiculous valuations that are not rooted in reality. And so I think those, where you see those cultures is often connected to those things. And so for me, the conclusion I've come to is the underpinning reason for that is because you don't know what makes you worth anything anymore, right? And so you overcompensate for that by making the culture all about these other things, like busyness, like loving the company, like being a family, because those cover the fact that you've lost your sense of purpose because it's been muddied. And actually, if you look at like a local authority, that's the challenge they have there and have had for decades and decades, because they're taking money, they're providing services, but there's very little connection to even between the people that are running the organisation and the politicians that are advising them. There's a pretty poor disconnect between those two things, and so you end up with these kind of cultural gaps. And I think that we see that more and more in business as our definition of what makes success in business gets muddier. What I do as a leader is I try and explain that to everybody that I'm working with and everybody in my team, and I try and compensate for that by giving them the clarity of what success looks like and what good looks like and how that fits into what makes the business tick. But in many organizations, people don't do that. They instead have these proxies about values, which are often about loving the leader and telling the boss they're the best thing since sliced bread, loving the company, being super busy, right? Because if you've lost your way about what actually your job contributes to the success of the organizations, then those become things that you can do. I can serve my boss, I can be the busiest person here. Those things become, I can be the most available person. But actually, none of those are the things that make a company worth anything anywhere. And, I know Elon Musk, there's an awful lot of criticism of him, but I think that actually he's somebody that does just cut through all of that and is much more direct about, this is what I want, this is what good looks like. He's just so incredibly ruthless that nobody can even have one off day. But what he does is focus on actually what are the values here, what does matter. And a lot of organizations lose that, and it becomes something very disconnected to really what makes them valuable.
Yeah, and the other thing that I'd written that I really wanted to come back to was talking about busy. I've written here, busy in quotes equals value. And it that really struck a chord with me, because a couple of months ago I was having a conversation with someone, and they just said to me, I'm just so busy. And for whatever reason, in that moment, I thought, does that mean that you're burning out, or does that mean you're really, really productive? And it got me thinking about how I might use that word, busy. And I think that busy is a catch-all term for so many things. And I completely agree. There is definitely a purpose of using that word to push out some sort of image of, I am working a lot and I'm working really hard, but it doesn't come with an awful lot of meaning.
I hear that as a cry of pain, really, when I hear people talk about how busy they are. There's an element of desperation of, tell me that means I'm okay, tell me that means I'm good. It's like, I'm busy, therefore don't sack me, therefore I'm important, therefore I'm successful, therefore I'm worthy. That's how I hear that. And when that becomes kind of the group think, it's just this death spiral into, well, there are only 24 hours in every day and 7 days in every week. There are only so many emails you can send and so many meetings you can show up to. And that it's because it's fundamentally empty. It's empty. So people then they're feeling empty. They know they're doing all of this stuff. It's hard. It is, I think, part of the mental health crisis we've got going on definitely stems from that, because nobody anymore seems to feel it's okay to not say that they're busy as well. It's like that's not allowed to say, oh no, I'm not really busy, I've not got much on this week. When do you ever hear anybody say that? It's become a non-thing. You're not allowed to say that anymore.
Do you have a kind of secret agenda against the word busy? So, that comes out in a productive way?
I hope not, because we all have really busy days and busy weeks. So it's not being anti that. What I try and understand is what's going on in the culture, because when I start going to meetings or having emails that are empty but nobody else treats them as being empty, that's kind of the red flag. And then when I see people that are creating more of this and inviting more of it and driving more of it, and so it's that classic thing, I'm sure you've experienced this as well, when you've been to a meeting that you thought was utterly pointless, and then a couple of days later you hear other people talking about it and you think, were they in the same meeting as me? Because I found that like just an hour of my life I'm never going to get back. And here people are talking about it as if it was like, some UN summit or something. And that then starts to undermine my belief and my confidence in those people's judgment. And what I don't do is then leap and think, oh, it's that person, because it rarely is. It's more about the culture. And when that starts to happen time and time again, that's the red flag, because actually, and particularly in our work, what that does is make it very, very difficult to do anything real. Because the more a culture is built on emptiness, the more any real change becomes very, very difficult to make happen, because you have either everybody piles in on it and so you never get a decision made, or there's, you make a small change to something and then you find that, 50 meetings and 3 committees have been created to debate the small change. And it becomes kind of paralysis, really. And so that's what I'm looking for. And the busyness is a kind of a symptom of that very often. And it's often one of the easiest symptoms to spot, because you see these people going to back-to-back meetings. And if there's never any agenda, if there's never any outcomes, if there's never any actions on the back of it, then I start to question what they're doing. And to me, that's then a sign that any real change, real success is not going to be very viable in that organisation. And the worst thing is when you see organisations that are super effective start to move that way. And that can happen just from 2 or 3 key appointments in the organisation can start to make things, because they bring value sets with them that are not conducive to actually making things happen. So often, if I'm going to do a Salesforce project, I try and understand that landscape of the organisation first, because if it is like that with all that kind of busy work and emptiness, you have to carve out a space for where your project is going to happen that's kind of got some barriers up to protect it from that, if your project is actually going to be successful at all.
So thank you so much for your reflections on your career journey. And we've definitely dove in deep around busyness and culture and just really interesting things that I'll be certainly taking on with me in my future roles and the organizations that I play a part in. I think with that, we can probably move on to the next theme, which is personal and holistic approach. We've spoken or touched on briefly mental health, and we've touched on through that with busyness and the 24/7 availability culture. I guess in your role as a leader, but also in you as a person, and maybe we start with the person first. Do you think you've got a good balance between your professional life and personal life?
I think so, and I think it's easy for me to say because my child is grown up, so I'm not in the eye of the storm. When you are trying to work, trying to live your own life, and you've got small children, at that point in your life, work-life balance is much more tactical. It is literally about you've got to drive here, drop them off there, then go there, then do this, then do that, right? Balance is much more meaningful. And so I don't want to take anything away from what that means, but I guess what I've come to the conclusion of, I think, is that work-life balance, we often think about that as being time, money, and actions, but my conclusion is it's much more about how we think and feel. And so in that way, I think I've got a really good work-life balance because I think I have a really healthy perspective on work and life. And that doesn't mean things in my work and life are both perfect or even great. But what it means is I think I have a healthy attitude to them. And the challenge for many people is that when they're thinking about work-life balance, they're coming from a place where they already feel like they're failing in one or all of those roles already. And when you feel like that, it actually then doesn't matter what the balance is, what the time is, because you always are going to feel like you're failing. So it's that classic thing of seek and you shall find. If you feel like you're failing, you'll be able to find plenty of evidence of all the ways that you're failing. If you feel like you're brilliant, you'll find plenty of evidence of that too. And those things occur regardless of the actual balance of time, money, and energy and all of that stuff. It comes from a place of how we feel in us and how powerful we feel, because the ability to choose to do emails in the evening or not to, that is, again, an internal thing. That comes from how we feel and what we want to do and what our attitude is. And only us as individuals can develop that way of thinking. There are obviously times and situations and roles where we're under pressure, especially with small kids. You get a kid that's off sick, you have to go and pick them up from the nursery and cuddle them all afternoon. You can't work, and that might then, sod's law, it probably will clash with the most important meeting of the year, right? These things always happen, and that is a very profound work-life balance challenge right there. What I think is that people are usually really, really good at handling those situations, those kind of moments of acute challenge. People typically deal very well with. It's more the day-to-day grinding stuff that makes people feel challenged around work-life balance. And that does come down to more about how people are feeling rather than necessarily those challenges. And so, yeah, I feel like I'm in a pretty good place. And I often say to other women, particularly, I feel like having my baby was a kind of a shortcut to get into that good place. Because when you have a small child, especially when you go back to work when they're a baby, things are out of your control, right? You are forced to learn a different set of attitudes and values because you're not just in control. You can't just decide, I'm just going to stay at the office till 7 or 8. You just can't do that anymore. So you begin to learn, well, it doesn't matter anyway. It's irrelevant whether I stay at the office till 7 to 8, 99% of the time. And you kind of get the opportunity to develop different thinking. When you don't have kids, it's easy to be all consumed by your work, and it's much tougher to break out of that on your own without having something that helps you.
I wondered, did you what kind of challenges did you come across in your career, and maybe even kind of up until recently, around that? And I mean this in a way of like, what can we learn from that? Because as you know, I've got 2 really young children myself, and I work in an industry where travel is very, very common and very, very frequent. It does not work for me. I'd much rather be here than there. So I wonder, did you have any experiences in your career, sort of standout ones that you could share with us?
Well, and you've got girls as well, haven't you? So, they're going to be facing some of these challenges one day. I think things have changed a lot over 30 years I've been at work, and they've changed culturally in the world of work and in society. They also change as you change. Like, so from when I was like the 18-year-old girl at work, and even young in my 20s, how I would get treated kind of like as a dolly bird or whatever, to now, that's partly different because the world has changed, and partly different because I'm older now. And I think there is still an element of that in the way that young women get treated. And then you go through kind of having children and you get treated differently there. I also think that there's a big difference about whether you're single or in a relationship. And I've had all sorts of challenging experiences in interacting with men over the course of my career, and that doesn't go away. And challenges of just being a woman. So for me, training as a barrister, one occasion I remember really strongly is that you do academic training, but you also train through your Inn of Court, and that's much more practical. So you do a lot of mock moots, so pretending to be in courtroom situations, either interviewing witnesses on the stand or doing opening or closing statements or whatever. And usually there will be barristers there giving you feedback, but then masters of the bench, who are usually judges or very senior barristers, who are kind of the ultimate feedback people. And one time I was doing a mock moot, and one of the barristers giving feedback was a woman, and she was very, very positive about what I did. Like, actually all the feedback was really good. And then the judge says, oh, well, the trouble with women in this profession is that their voices are just too high. And I was like, right, okay, that says a lot, doesn't it? And there are many, many examples of challenges with men. But I think one of the things that's quite difficult for us to talk about is challenges among women. And that's because we've got so much work to do still in overcoming male-dominated workplaces and male-structured ways of working, that it seems like we don't have the time to argue amongst ourselves as women. Like, and I'm big on that as well. Like, if we're criticizing each other, then that's not helping us drive forward with our challenges against workplace, which is ultimately patriarchal. If you look at office work, it was designed around men, with women to support men through secretarial work, and that was it for women, and you got married and you stopped working. So everything from 9 to 5 Monday to Friday to the physical layout of offices, this is all designed by men for men, and we still see a lot of that. Like, things haven't really changed very much about that stuff, and we forget that was set up by men, and there is no universal law about 9 to 5 in the office. That was a creation, and it's meaningless, and it doesn't really suit women. And it's okay that we challenge that, but we've sort of forgotten that's where that all comes from. But one of the challenges I do kind of think we need to begin to address is amongst us as women. I don't know if you've watched the TV show Slow Horses, but I've watched that, and then I've been reading the books lately. And there is a woman in that, the character is called Diana Taverner, and she is, for many years, second desk, they call it, so second in charge of MI5, and eventually manages to get the top job. And throughout, she's a very interesting character as a woman, because she's proud of being a woman and she wants other women to be successful, but equally she loves it when she's the only woman in the room, and she doesn't want any direct competition. She wants to be the only woman there, but she also wants women to come through and be successful, and there is a tension there in her thoughts and feelings about that. And I think that we don't talk enough about some of those tensions that there are between women, and we see it a little bit, women that want to be equals but also hang on to some of the old-fashioned ideas, particularly in relationships, about men opening doors or men paying for the first date or men sending flowers, and women hang on to some of these things as much as they want things to be different in other settings. And so in my personal experience, one of the biggest challenges I find is that women's behaviour in relationships means that men often bring that baggage into the workplace. So one of the things in the tech space we look at a lot is about women entrepreneurs being able to get funding, and the challenge for women in getting funding out of men. And yet for a while I was part of a female entrepreneurs group, and often the women would say, "Oh, my husband just doesn't take my business seriously." And I'd say, "Okay, tell me about your business." "Oh, well, I make cards on Etsy." And I'm like, "Okay, so how much do you turn over?" "Like £350. "Oh, what, a year?" And I think, okay, so your husband's doing a job that he probably hates, because let's be honest, not everybody loves their job. Most of us are like, if we won the lottery, we wouldn't still be doing it. And he's got the pressure of going to a job that he probably doesn't really enjoy, that you probably beat him up for the amount of hours that he spends doing it, and he's bringing home all the money to pay all the bills, and yet you're saying he doesn't take your business seriously enough. So if then I'm a woman with a business idea and I go and have a meeting with your husband after you've just nagged him about not taking your business seriously, that is all echoing around his head as I'm asking him to invest £100,000 in our project or my business idea. And as women, we can't kind of have it both ways. And I think that women often don't even realise the consequences. There's still all this, and it's a pressure on both men and women. It's not a criticism of women, it's a criticism of the patriarchal society in which we live in, where there are all these trite ideas that women are supposed to hide their spending from their husbands and all this kind of naff stuff. But we forget that actually we don't compartmentalize our brains like that, that all of these experiences come into our work lives. And so I think that we need to work harder on that. I also think it's great that we hear men talk more these days about being involved in their kids' lives. I hear a lot more men doing the school run. I think we did this morning, which is great. There's a lot more men who are very involved in doing this stuff, but I think that we've still got a distance to go, because I think there's still quite a lot of times where men I've worked with are doing that to help their wives or under instructions from their wives, where when it comes to the household, the woman is the manager, and it might be that the man is a member of staff and she can give him tasks to do, but it's that the woman is ultimately responsible. I've often wondered, if you contacted every school in the country to say who's the emergency contact for every child, what the balance would be between men and women, because I would bet that at least 70% it's still the mum that is the emergency contact, and she may delegate the job to the husband when she's got a more important meeting than he is, but she's still the point person. And so I think that there is lots for us to work on, but that's not to say that we haven't come a long way already. But I think that the challenge is almost that women need to accept our role in sustaining the patriarchy as we do, and we need to challenge that a little bit more, and that maybe it's easy for me to say as a single person looking at relationships and just sort of face palming often with how they don't seem to really have changed very much since the 50s or 60s, and women often weaponize behaviors in relationships that are part of sustaining the patriarchy. And I think there's a lot we need to do to challenge that.
So much I want to say. So much I want to say. How much do I actually need to say? The one thing that really struck a chord with me, and actually it's the case so far that I've only interviewed women or spoken with women so far on the podcast, and that will be changing soon enough. But every single woman that I've spoken to, which is all of them, has said or shared the same types of sentiment. What really stood out to me, two things. One was that I do most of the drop-offs and the pickups and all these kind of things, and it just works for us. So that's how it happens. And I was at a birthday party recently for one of my child's friends, and I was talking with the mum, and it was mostly mums there, very few dads, and which also makes me feel a bit awkward sometimes, right? Because I find it a bit difficult to break in. But I was speaking with her, and I was like, oh, so what, kind of, long way of saying it, where's the child's dad? And not in an aggressive way, but where is he? What's he do? And she was like, oh, he hates this type of thing. Like, he's more interested in reading business books than he is in sort of coming to this kind of thing. And it is definitely, and that made me really sad, because this is a massive part of the child's life, is who they are friends with, and there's opportunities there, not least to just get to know people, but connections and all this great stuff, which is how life is really formed and how things really change. And then at the drop-offs and the pickups and all these kind of things, like I was invited to the school that just goes to talk to some of the governors with some other parents that had been invited as well. And I was the only dad of 5 or 6 parents that were there. So I feel that very acutely, and I see that, and I don't ever think about how what I'm doing might affect something elsewhere. And I'm certainly not looking for that. But as you were talking about it, I was thinking, okay, maybe there's an element of importance to this beyond just what works practically for us as a family.
Yeah. I think there is, and I think it is the patriarchy. The definition of the patriarchy is controlling the roles of men and women in society. It isn't something that men do to women. It is something that the powerful do to the masses. And the whole definition of relationships and the purpose of relationships, marriage is about controlling assets. It's about having children. So people are going into with a vision of roles and purpose. So it's not that I'm saying that men are getting married and having kids without that necessarily being what they want, which is why that then they're not then interested in that stuff, because they're doing it because it's their duty and it's the right thing to do, and they're doing it for their wives and everything. But I think there is an element of that, and that's why they're not thinking, oh my God, this isn't a way of observing these kids and learning about them and seeing them, which it sounds like that's what you're interested in doing. Is I want to know them and I want to get an insight into their world and their lives. And that's sadly also not what a lot of the mums are doing there. The mums are almost in a little one-up competition on who's had the new car the most recent, or who's got the fanciest holiday planned. And these are all part of the patriarchy. Then that's how we are taught that we should behave and operate. And I honestly believe that until we start to challenge some of that, we're not going to be able to make a huge amount of progress at work, because those fixed ideas, they pollute the work environment. You can't escape them. And definitely, being a woman of my age and being single is, it's challenging, because people don't know then what to make of me. It just doesn't fit. There's not enough of us out there. Whereas if I'd been married for 20 years, people feel much more comfortable about being able to go, oh, okay, she fits neatly into this box. or even if I was gay, it would be easier to go, okay, she's this, that's the thing. It's really, we've come a long way, but now we're hitting new barriers, and those barriers are butting right up against how we are as people outside of work, and then what we bring to work about that.
I'm a big fan of continuous improvement. As to like everything that I do, I try and remember those two words. And I think you're spot on. And there's plenty more we could say, I'm sure, on the topic. But I can completely agree. Like the more we can have these kind of open, transparent, and respectful types of conversations, both, as you were saying before, between women, between men and women in the workplace, the more opportunity there is for continuous improvement, right? Rather than shutting down complex and challenging ideas, because we're not going to improve anything unless we're challenging ourselves, right? The improvement doesn't come from not being challenged.
Yeah, exactly. And feminism is not about beating men up at all. It's about this, and in a way, the way that women in the workplace and their challenges are positioned, that being positioned as something that we need to get men to fix, almost, that just feeds into this same scenario, right? This is something that we need to work on together and change together, because we're all in it, and we need to change these models of how men and women interact, and we can't just do that at work.
So thank you so much for your reflections on your personal life and the work-life balance. I wondered if you had any personal heroes or role models, either you currently work with or alongside or have worked with in the past, and what traits you admired about them that made them personal heroes or role models to you.
That's a really good question. I think there's 2 or 3 heroes that I have, although not people that I've worked with, but a couple of people that I have worked with that have been really influential to me. So the first one is somebody I worked with quite early in my career. It was one of my first jobs, and it was working for an insurance subsidiary of the Bank of Scotland. And my boss there was this woman called Sasha Wright, and she was just brilliant. And I think what I really admired about her was that she was somebody who understood every job in her department, and she understood what made the business tick, and she understood how what we did related to the business overall. She just had this great understanding of quite a complex business. And she was also a natural process thinker. So she would be really great at having a structure and a plan for how you do things. And I had other jobs, but I'd never seen anybody that operated in that way before. So, and it was also a great bit of circumstance, because it was a startup business, but it was about 18 months old when I joined. So there was quite a lot of processes already in place, quite a high volume of business being transacted, but there were still new things to do. So there was that great thing of coming in and everything being new, which we know is kind of the holy grail, because so often you go into an organisation and there are processes that are decades old, and it's really difficult to change and improve everything. Whereas here it was a great combination of being new, but also well established. And working with Sasha was really eye-opening, because she was so structured. I learned a lot from her about how to think, about how to approach a process. But she was also not rigid. So it was about the fastest, most effective way to go from A to B, not hung up on kind of what we've done before or politics or any of that stuff. And back then, so this was in the 90s, so we did have a computer system, an AS400 in insurance, but a lot of what we did was paper orientated. And so coming up with good processes that use paper, actually means that you are pushed to be better than you are when you have computers. So, a lot of the work that we do is in Salesforce.com, and there is so much efficiency built into Salesforce that I think when people are designing their processes, it enables them to be lazy. Right? So, because the computer kind of picks up the slack. If there's loads of rubbish data, well, it's all kind of hidden because it's somewhere in Salesforce. If you're doing this on paper and you have a physical filing cabinet with all these files in, and you're going to have to search through them to find the one that you want, you have to be much more efficient, because it's your own time that you're wasting and yourself that is going to suffer for any errors that you make and any rubbish that's in there. And I think that focuses minds a lot better than sometimes when you have Salesforce and people can just kind of go, oh, well, that's the system's problem, or the computer must sort that out. And that's not really the way to design a good Salesforce org. And so having watched Sasha operate and work with her on setting up some new processes, I learned a lot from that time that I still use today when I'm working on projects. And one of the things I'll often say to people is, if you didn't have a computer, if you had to do this on paper, how would you go about doing it? Because that's often quite a good way to coalesce some thinking around a tangible challenge. Because I don't know about you, but I often find customers say, oh, well, you need to tell me what best practice is because I don't know how Salesforce works. And then I'll be saying, well, but I don't know how you guys work, so you need to tell me what you want. And actually then looking at, forget computers for a minute, what's the job that needs to be done, what's the most efficient way to do it, imagine that there isn't a computer, is quite a good way to start some of those conversations, I often find, when you're at a bit of a block.
Yeah, what I really like, because formally we were talking about, I think it was maybe one of the first few things that you said was about ensuring that people understand why they're in the organization, what their purpose is, so that they can aim towards something. And that was part of the conversation about values. We were talking about how values are empty if you don't have purpose, if I could summarize it in that kind of way. The one thing that really struck me as well when you were talking about your career journey was that you have worked in some very large organizations. You've worked in some very small organizations, as well as setting up your own business, which you sold. And again, congratulations for that. That's a lovely thing. I wonder, tying those two things together, do you think it's more or less or the same kind of level of importance having a sense of purpose in a larger organization versus a smaller organization? Do you know what I mean? I
do. I think that it's equally important. I think it's more difficult to achieve in a larger organization. And so I think in a smaller organization, there is more directness between every employee and everything. Right? So there's more directness between the employees and the CEO, more directness between them and whoever's funding the business, more directness between getting paid. So usually in a small organization, every salesperson or every person in a service role is also carrying a bit of responsibility for making sure that their customer pays them or does whatever the customer is responsible for. And you might have somebody very senior ask you. At Conga, used to freak out the new hires often because Mark, who's the founder and COO and based in Colorado, he'd sometimes just send these like one-line Salesforce chatter messages saying WTF with a link to some record that they'd missed a field on logging, and people would be like, oh my god, am I going to get sacked? And no, of course not. Mark is like the loveliest person you could meet, but that kind of direct connection, I was never going to get a message like that from the CEO of IBM, right? It's not, you can do that easily in a company. When I joined Conga, there were 30 people or something, and you can't do that if you've got 350,000 people. So there is a directness that makes it easier to have that connection to what the purpose of the organization is. That makes it easier, but you're still dependent on leadership to actually be bold enough to be transparent. And it is about boldness, because a lot of founders and leaders of smaller companies think that professionalism means putting up this facade of of control and not telling people what's going on and not sharing information. But actually that's a very false idea. Being open, being transparent, that's actually the braver thing to do and shows more power and more control, because you're confident enough to be open and to share information. And for often people early as leaders, they can find that difficult. They can find that intimidating, because what comes with that openness, of course, is the potential for people to disagree and criticize and so on. In large organizations, I think it's equally important that people have that connection to their purpose in the organization. If anything, I think it's more important because it's easier to just almost disappear and take it for granted that you're going to keep your job. Take it for granted you're going to get paid at the end of the month, which you can't quite do in a very small organization. But the main reason I think it's important is that if you don't have that clarity about how does my role, my team, myself contribute to this organization, alternative sets of meaning arise. And you end up with multiple little cultures existing within the organization. And some of those can be very damaging. I think we've all seen where you end up with some middle manager that is running a kind of cabal within a bigger organization that is their own thing, that maybe doesn't fit with the values of the organization, but is how that person individually wants to run things. We've also maybe seen teams and wondered what on earth they do and why they exist in an organization. And these things happen because nobody wants to be a bad leader. Nobody wants to be in a pointless team. So people aren't sitting there thinking that that's what's going on. They're sitting there with a set of beliefs about their job and their value that maybe don't fit with actually what the business is all about. But in a larger organization, these things can persist. Whereas in a small organization, even just one individual like that sort of sticks out like a sore thumb and is easier to resolve. But in a big organization, especially across multiple sites and so on, it's really easy for these things to arise. And for us doing Salesforce projects, we also see the kind of sharp end of this a lot, because that's when you find out how a business that should have one way of working actually has 97 different ways of working, because each site, they might have 30 sites in the UK, and each one of them has their own set of rules and values about how they process business, and different naming conventions for different things that don't need different naming conventions. They could just have one. And when you start to try and reconcile that, then you find out what a death grip people have on some of these ideas and concepts and ways of working, and how they don't want to release them. And that it all stems from the fact that those are the things that have created meaning for them at work, but that is not the meaning that the shareholders or the owners or the CEO necessarily wants, and actually might be a massive waste of time and money, but nobody's ever looked at it. And often it's only when you're doing some big change project that these things are surfaced.
Yeah, and often I'm thinking of so many projects that I've done where the unofficial part, the unofficial goal of the project is to find 20% of the wastage. It might be termed efficiencies or whatever, but it's a really interesting insight to think of how we get to that point, which is, if people don't understand the purpose of the organization and the direction, and they don't know how their role contributes to that, then you can allow yourself to have lots of offshoots and separate paths. So thank you so much for sharing that insight. And I would love to move us on now to leadership and values, the third theme. So you've mentioned some really great points that I've been noting down and sitting on desperately wanting to ask you, but wanting to ask you at the right moment. And I think now is the moment. So you mentioned earlier on that you restarted your career after 18 months away from work, which I don't know if that's strictly maternity, right? I think that's like a business term for a certain type of leave, but it was at least to look after your your child. I wondered, now we're thinking about leadership. You presumably have and continue to lead women going through similar life events as yourself. How have you kind of embedded in your leadership style, I guess at first, like an awareness for how women are being treated? And I'm thinking also specifically about that maternity piece and the becoming a mother and coming back to work. Do you think you do anything different, or you do something that other people should be doing when it comes to kind of supporting women going through similar kind of life events to what you've had?
That's a really good question. I would hope everybody is operating in a similar way, but I don't know that they always are. So I think that you start from empathy, which is really important, whatever people are going through. And I've worked with women going through a number of challenges over time, everything from losing a pregnancy or recovering from a stillbirth. These things, they're not things that affect you for 6 weeks or 6 months. They affect you for forever. Or there is a chap I was the manager of years ago who had previously had cancer, been 10 years or so since he'd been in recovery, and had a cancer scare. And that was incredibly traumatic for him. And actually he was fine, but he had probably about 3 months of needing to go for tests and scans and get feedback. And that time was horrific for him. And he tried not to say anything, and it impacted his performance. And then I was getting pressure to performance manage him, and then that came out. And I hadn't even known he'd had cancer previously, let alone that he was going through all of this. So there are many challenges that people come up with. I guess there are 2 or 3 things that I try to do. So in large organisations, it would be unlikely that I'd be in the kind of role that could influence maternity policy, for example. And I think that in our very largest global organisations, they're usually either brilliant or terrible on mat leave policy, right? You've got these 2 extremes. So I'd actually hold IBM up as an example of a really terrific approach to mat leave. I don't know what they're like globally. In the UK, they've got a really great policy, and it's exemplary. There are other large organisations whose approach is to do whatever is the legal minimum. I can understand that because that saves them some risk and complexity, but I think that's really sad if that's how organisations approach it. For smaller organisations, I'm usually in a position where I can influence what that maternity leave policy is. So in 2 or 3 companies, I've been lucky enough to basically write the mat leave policy. And so my thinking is always to be generous, because hiring a new employee is so much more risky and expensive than having somebody return to work after maternity leave. To me, financially, it's a no-brainer to invest in your maternity leave. And one of the things that I always like to do when I have the opportunity of creating maternity leave policy is to write in a return to work bonus. Right. So if somebody is off for a year and comes back to work, then rather than having that kind of sort of Damocles hanging over them of, if you leave, you must pay us back, which a lot of these policies have, and I understand why you'd have an element of that, I try and switch that the other way around to be, if you come back and you stay, after 9 months back, you're going to get this bonus. Because the most generous mat leave policy is never going to put somebody in the position that they were in had they worked all year. They're always going to be worse off financially. And when you come back to work, you're poorer, right? Because you've got to pay for childcare. Even if you're lucky enough to have your mum round the corner doing the childcare, raising a child adds costs to your life, and you're inheriting these costs on the back of a year of low pay. And that's tough for everybody. And to me, I think if I'm going to have a maternity leave policy that's generous enough to encourage people to come back, I then want to do whatever I can to make that manageable for them, to enable them to be successful when they come back. And having that bonus when you've got all those expenses is a way of helping people back into the position they would have been and rewarding them for coming back and hard work. And I guess my thinking about that is based on my own personal experience, because when I went back to work, so my daughter would have been 3 going on 4. So I went back to work like the sort of 10 months before she started school. And it was almost impossible to go back at that point. I mean, right since she'd been born, I was putting, over 80% of my net salary towards the cost of childcare. That just wasn't sustainable. And by the time I restarted my career, I was single and having to do that. And I was, so my outgoings every month were more than my income. And effectively, I was betting on myself. And I carried on doing that for many, many years. At that point, actually, I was lucky enough to be able to get the Working Families Tax Credit, which was worth to me about £650 a month. My nursery fees were £1,000, but that offset the costs of my going back to work. I mean, of course, this was 18 years ago or so very different. It's much more expensive today. But actually, if I'd had a bonus or something for going back to work, that could have changed everything for me, because I'm in a position now where all these years later I'm still playing catch up financially for that time, and I'm nearly caught up, but it's taken that long. And so I know what that's like, and I don't want to put anybody else in that position. And I actually think it's reasonable that the employee and the employer share the risk and reward of that. So if I have somebody that returns to work and is doing a good job, I want to be able to reward them with that bonus so that then they're not losing out like I did. Basically, that's my thinking.
Yeah, and I love it. We, as you know, we've got 2 children, and one of them even more recent than the other, which is not surprising. But during the first when my first child was born, my wife was working in the same organization that she is now, and their maternity policy was something like 6 weeks, 90% pay, and then the rest was statutory minimum, which was a really big hit for us. And I was just lucky that I was working and things were going well for me. And her return to work was begrudging. It was with this really heavy weight of bitterness, I suppose, that's so outdated. And things have moved very quickly in the past even 5 years and 3 years when it comes to expectations for parental cover, not even just maternity cover and sharing between mums and dads. But then the second baby that we had, the company that she works for, updated their policy that it was something like 9 months on 90% pay or something like that, and then a much lesser time on the statutory minimum. And that won back all of the bitterness, I think, that had been dredged up in that first one. But then it also, I could see, as well as her affecting her personally and us financially, her return to work after the second child was so much more positive and so much more forward thinking, because it wasn't like the thing that's always boggled my mind about having a child and also having work is that having a child is necessary for the survival of the human race. But for some reason, work doesn't seem to care about that, or it hasn't traditionally. So I'm really grateful for your perspective and for your honesty, right, about where you've come from and how you've reached there. Previously, you mentioned about the 24/7 availability and the buzz that's associated with that, and you said that's great for a CEO, but it's not for staff because it leads to burnout and it creates this busy culture, like you were saying, or at least contributes to it. As a leader, how do you, I guess, in part, demonstrate that that's not the kind of culture you want, the sort of 24/7 availability? And how do you create policy or behaviors within your teams that exemplify that and that kind of lead to teams that don't think they must be available 24/7?
I think it comes down to modeling the behavior that you want and being open about your values. Because actually, if and this is a ridiculous example, but if the building was on fire or if our primary customer was burning down, I do want people to be available in the middle of the night, right? You know, I wouldn't have a problem asking people to be like, quick, there's an emergency, you need to help. So what I don't want, though, is that kind of silly, oh my God, I've had an email, I must reply to it instantly kind of behavior. So what I try to do is to be and to live the values myself of being able to understand what's important and what's not important, and being really clear about that, and being able to switch off at times and not have that weight of I must be checking my email or I must reply instantly. It's about creating a culture where I say, these are the things that I value. You know, is the customer happy? Have we got enough money in the bank? You know, what are the core metrics? Or even in a bigger organization, you can have the core success factors, and these maybe are the top 2 or 3 core success factors that we would spin the earth to address. Everything else doesn't matter, so that they know I have no interest in presenteeism. I have no interest in, I'm not calculating who's the person who's always responding most to the Slack messages or the emails, and openly talk about that and laugh about it and share about it. And that kind of creates a culture where I hope that people can feel safe, because those kind of 24/7 behaviours often are coming from people who don't feel safe or feel like that's the route to success. And yet really none of that is worth anything to any company ever. So it's a silly way to operate, in my view.
Thank you. And I guess then that kind of leads on to the next question, really, which is, what for you are the key qualities of a successful leader?
That varies because organizations are so different, times are so different. You need the right person at the right time. So I think it's a bit of a truism, but self-awareness is the most important thing to you know, for all of us. I think, what's the point of life? Know thyself is definitely up there as part of the point. And so knowing your own strengths and weaknesses, understanding whether you're the right leader at the right time in the right place, and not necessarily throwing yourself on the sword going, oh God, I'm the wrong leader, I'm just going to go and resign and go on the dole. That's not what I mean. It's about saying, these are the things that I'm really good at, here are the gaps, and I think some of these gaps are really important right now. How can I lean on people to help me fill those? That's what I mean. And when you talk openly about yourself, then you create more of a team culture. Because I think one of the biggest fallibilities we have right now is this idea that it's one leader means everything. You know, that's just not realistic. It's got to be a team sport, and the job of the leader is to carry a whole bunch of the responsibility. And that's why the leader gets paid more, is because they have to carry the responsibility. It needs to fall on their shoulders. So they should be being paid for responsibility rather than activity. And that's then where they should have a team of people, because often the biggest challenge in organisations is people want to get involved. People want to take on leadership. They want to have some independence and empowerment. And a leader that blocks that is a very poor leader often, but usually they're blocking it for the right reasons. They're blocking because they want to protect people and look after people and not burden them. But that is very patronising and not what anybody wants. So you have to carry the responsibility, but that doesn't mean that you do everything. And sometimes I see leaders who, it looks to me like they want to do all the stuff that's going to be fun, that's going to give them profile, that's going to let them be the speakers, that's going to let them pretend to be involved in everything crucial. And and then guess what? They're really good people immediately below them quit and go somewhere else. I think that working towards knowing yourself, being transparent about your strengths and weaknesses, and building a team, those are the most important things.
Thank you. Yeah, and on your last point, the more people I talk to as part of this podcast, there's more of a kind of distinguishing a leadership type between a leader who is climbing the ladder and pulling it up behind them, or at least not even focusing on what's happening below them. And then there's the type of leader who actually is in their leadership position, and they might be going somewhere, but actually most of their focus is focused down, in quotes, or at least to their team and to their peers and to enablement. The one thing I wanted to ask you, a long time ago in one of my previous roles, I was listening in on a conversation between a female member of staff who was very senior in the organization and a male member of staff who was also very senior in the organization, and this was a consultancy. And my ears picked up when I heard they were talking about the idea of, that men, or male privilege, I'm not entirely sure what it is, but, the idea that men have already got a head start and that there needs to be more focus on enabling women to come up into those roles, and that kind of discussion, and the woman was saying to the man, I've never been held off in my career in the past, and I've got a son, and I'm really worried that he's not gonna get the same opportunities as other women his age might get. And I remember the man replying, "Yeah, I don't understand it. It's all ridiculous. Like everything is equal here." And what was painfully ironic about that conversation is that I knew very well the lady's line manager, who was obviously even more senior in the company, and he had told me previously, and not so far away from that conversation, not too long before that conversation happened, that he doesn't like women in leadership positions. And there was this moment where I was sat there with this knowledge of, I heard, and I was very young at the time, and these days I wouldn't allow for that kind of opinion to be shared without sharing it out, right? Because it's a very obvious discrimination. At the time when I was listening to that conversation, I was thinking, God, if only you knew that this stuff is happening, even though it's not really very obvious. And so I think we, as you and I have spoken about the need to be empathetic towards everyone's needs and where they're at, and you come at life with your a vast amount of great and challenging experiences being a woman and rising to where you are, which is top levels of everything, which is just incredible. Some people listening to our conversation might be thinking it's very kind of female oriented, and maybe Penny looks only at women and tries to promote women, and I'm sure that there's people that might even think even more extreme things about the whole diversity agenda, right? And sort of promoting people over other people who might be more capable. I wonder, as someone in a leadership position and someone who has your own experiences and a want to make other people maybe in a similar position to yourself successful, how do you kind of check yourself? How do you make sure that your kind of level of support that you're sharing out there is balanced to the kind of the culture and the moment and the context?
So that's a really good question, and speaks to points around positive discrimination, which is one of those terms that sets off red flags for many, many, many of us. There is a great cartoon, I'm sure you'll have seen, that shows kind of a row of maybe 4 characters trying to look over a fence. And it describes the differences between advantage and disadvantage. So you'll see them, and maybe there's one very tall man who can look over the fence, and then there's 3 characters that can't see over the fence. And it gives various versions. So it gives them each a step that's the same. And the tall man, he can just be even taller and see even further, and nobody else can still see over the fence. And then what you do is you actually give a step to each that reflects what they need. So the shortest person needs the biggest step, and different people need different things. And that is the answer. That's what equality is really about, is about supporting people in the ways that they need to have the same starting point as everybody else. So it's not about putting people ahead in the race. It's about, if it's a running race, making sure that actually everybody's got what they need so that they're starting from the same start point, because there are many, many people who actually aren't starting from the start. They're way, way back, and that there are issues around gender, race, disability, class. There's loads of things that are what make people start further back. And the answer to get people to the same starting point isn't to give more opportunities to people that are starting further back, right? Because what comes with that is that they inherit a whole load of attitudes and beliefs about themselves that mean it's a much bigger job to get them to the same starting point, and that it doesn't happen once. It happens with each new job and each new promotion. You go back because there are beliefs about yourself that are holding you back. And so it's a constant work in progress. And it can even be the same with men as well. You know, if men have constantly this refrain of, well, you're just in that role because you're white, middle-aged male, then that can devalue their own self-opinion, as we know. And there is a massive challenge around male mental health. And part of that is about a crisis in confidence and self-belief, and having that constant message of, oh, you're only there because you're the obvious candidate, because you're the easy one, because of male privilege, doesn't necessarily help men feel better about themselves. So there are challenges all over the place. And I suppose what I try and do is model what the values are and enable people to be successful on the back of those. There are other things that I do very tactically, Chris, that are maybe 2 or 3 good examples. I try and make sure like pay for like work, right? And particularly in small organizations, but it also happens in big, it's really easy for pay to get inconsistent, not because of bias or anything, but just hiring people at different times. Okay, so I always try and get pay back to as even as possible. And I've inherited people doing the same job where I've inherited 30k gaps in pay, right? So it takes time to get people back to neutral. So that's one thing, because pay does matter. Then the other thing that I do is, if I'm gonna create new roles in the business, if I'm going to create like a new management level or something, I invite everybody to apply for that job. And I will interview all internal candidates, because even if all that's doing is giving people a showcase to come and present and show me what they want, you know, there might only be 2 positions and 10 people to interview. They're not obviously all going to get the job, but that is important about transparency, because particularly in small organizations, you so often see hand-picked promotions, and that creates a culture of suspicion as to why was that person picked. And often, if that person is a woman or another minority, it can be, oh well, they were picked because it's positive discrimination, which may not be the case, but you don't even want to allow that narrative to arrive. And it's that whole thing of, you know, the truth will set us free. So the more transparent we can be about decision making, the less of it an issue there is around that. But one quick example, at Conga, the job was fairly technical. I would always hire people in batches of 3, and so I often ended up with a gender mix. And on more than one occasion, the women in the new hire group started on day 1 technically ahead of the men. After 6 weeks, the men were way ahead of the women. And having watched this several times, I was trying to understand what is happening here. And the conclusion I came to is that the men were braver about getting on the phones and taking calls. And that was the best way to learn, right? That supporting customers is how you learn, how you build your confidence, how you develop your skills. Whereas the women were like, no, I'm not ready yet. I need to practice more before I'm ready. And they wanted to be perfect before they took their first call, whereas the men kind of didn't care. They were like, I don't care, I'll take a call and see how it goes. And that was a very, very clear accidental experiment that proves the truth in a lot of what we hear about the differences between men and women of, a man will apply for a job if he meets 60% of the criteria, a woman won't think about it unless she's over 100%. And that was a very practical example of seeing that in real life. And I was probably on like my third or fourth cohort before I thought about trying to do anything to correct that balance, because forcing the women to take calls too early doesn't help their confidence any. When they see the men outperforming them, that doesn't help their confidence. It's not an easy challenge to resolve, actually. But it made me very aware that these things are real and that they are now. They are not just part of our history. And seeing those things, being aware of them, I think is one of the most useful things I can do as a leader.
Thank you. I was a bit nervous asking that question, actually. So thank you for responding so gracefully to, I think it's something that people think, right? And so thank you for applying some clarity to it from your perspective. So let's move on to the final theme now, which is mentorship, guiding and being guided. How do you approach mentorship with those who seek guidance from you?
That is a good question, because it's such a common topic at the moment, Chris, isn't it? People talk about mentoring a lot, and I've never been in a formal mentor-mentee relationship yet. I think it's probably something I've done many, many times. And so that's a kind of difficult one to answer. I think I probably do it without realizing it, both as mentor and mentee, if I'm honest. I think that I am one of those people who, a lot of people I've worked with in the past, they will call me or message me if they're having a problem at work. I mean, even people from like decades ago will message me and ask me if they've got a tough time that they're having at work and they need some advice, or they're thinking about taking a new job but they're not sure about it. I'm one of those people that folks will often ask. And for myself, there are a couple of people who've been really important mentors to me, but not in a formal mentoring relationship. So Sasha, who I spoke about earlier, she is a fantastic example for me to model, and I learned so much from her. But there is a guy called Ashley, who runs an organisation called Momentum Consulting, and I actually first met with them back when I was working at the Carbon Trust through the charity I was part of, National Energy Foundation, and we did training with them. Ashley Bookman, his name is, and it was called a negotiation and influencing course, but it was nothing like any other course I'd ever been on before. The first couple of days I thought, this is absolutely mental, what am I doing here, this is crazy. But by the end of it, they completely had me convinced. And because the training is all about how as human beings we interact with each other, and where the source of our interactions is coming from, because it's all about how we feel about ourselves, really. And so Ashley, I'd say, has probably been the most important mentor in my career, and I've introduced him to other people. I've had him do mentoring and training for other people, and he's somebody that really challenges me and gets me to think differently, and has a great input. And one of his colleagues, Murray, delivered that first course that I was on, and I was having some challenges with somebody in my team at the time. I didn't even realise how big the challenges were, but Murray completely opened my eyes about that, and for the first time probably in my career, he enabled me to be stronger for myself. You know, that was one of those key things of me thinking, this is a person with challenges who is presenting behaviours in our work that are a response to those challenges. This isn't about me, and this isn't something I can solve. And up until then, whatever the problem was, I'd been the one to bend myself out of shape to solve it. And that wasn't working with this woman. And that I was reaching the edges of how much more I could bend myself out of shape to try and make it work. And Murray enabling me to say, oh, actually, I don't need to do that, was really, really healthy and was a vital piece of my growth. So, yeah, those guys in particular have been very important to me.
And, the more I talk to people, and it's threaded throughout this whole conversation, the thing that stands out to me in every single conversation I've had so far is actually that a majority of the mentorship comes from what we observe in the culture and the environment around us and how people behave. And I was thinking back to that rule. It was like a 73855. I think that number is burnt into my head, which is that whole we communicate 7% words, 38% vocal, 55% non-verbal. So everyone is going around all the time, and over half of what they're doing and they're putting out is just what they're doing. I think probably one of the reasons why people come back to you is because your day-to-day is mentoring, right? And that's, I think, the quality of the best leaders. And if I was ever asked that question, I would say that actually it's a kind of embodiment of mentorship. Someone that is able to not only spend time with people to make sure that they're going in the right direction and doing all that great stuff, but actually they walk the walk themselves as well, which I think is that difference again between the leaders who pull the ladder up or are only looking upwards and the ones that are around them. So it obviously speaks volumes to how you conduct yourself in the workplace and why I enjoyed working with you anyway. And this is not like a heap praise on Penny moment, but it is just, it's the tying up of everything we've spoken about, I think. So maybe the last question I would ask you is whether you have a memorable mentorship moment, either where you witnessed significant growth in someone else, or someone either mentored you or demonstrated something that you would class as mentorship that really had a big impact on you.
Oh, so many examples, Chris, from small to massive. So there was a young woman I worked with a long time ago who sent me a message just recently to say that it's only looking back that she realised how great I was and and that was so nice to hear that. There was a time when I was working with somebody who was having a very, very difficult time at work and she needed to go off sick, she needed a lot more support and it wasn't forthcoming, and it was going to make a very big difference to her in her life, and I was able to support her through that, and that was really important. But there were 2 or 3 other examples. So the conversation I had with Murray about the challenge I was having with my colleague, and he said to me, I think she might be the most difficult to manage person I've ever encountered. And that just having somebody else be able to see it through my eyes and make me feel like, oh, it's not just me. It's not just that I'm not good enough for this, which had been kind of my natural thinking. That level of empathy to say that, it didn't solve any problems, but it made me feel a hell of a lot better instantly. And so just those small things that we can do can make a big difference. But there are also a couple of powerful examples. So there's a guy that used to be in my team, again, many years ago, James, who now runs his own business listed on the AIM stock exchange. He's been running this business for 10 years now. And again, I worked with him at a time when he was having a horrible experience at work where he was very sidelined. James, I think, has ADHD maybe. I think that's what he said. And I don't know whether he's been formally diagnosed, but he's definitely said that to me in the past. And it was at a time and at a place where his way of thinking and being was a great excuse for the business to vilify him. And didn't value all of those things that make him such a terrific entrepreneur and have enabled him to build this phenomenal business. And so for me, having been somebody who helped him navigate that and helped make sure that experience did not break him, that is something I will be proud of forever because of what he's gone on to achieve. Then there's a colleague who I think you know from Presido, who has had an astronomical rise in her career, going from being a kind of administrator in a business to making the leap into consulting, getting promoted about 3 times, and now has been identified as a future superstar at the massive global consultancy that she's now a part of, and still, you know, comes to me for support and mentorship when she's going through, you know, a promotion or a difficult project or whatever. So there are a few examples there that I am really, really proud of and really happy about. I just worked on a project recently with a colleague of mine, Lee, who again was somebody I hired into Conga, who had been wanting to get into tech, but had basically been a ski instructor for about 8 years and then worked in technology recruitment. And so it was a big, you know, for him, it felt like somebody's taking a chance on me. For me, it was a no-brainer, and he was absolutely like super stellar performer and made my life so much easier and was fantastic. And it's a joy to work with him again recently. And when people can see that and appreciate you for it, it fills my heart with gladness, really.
Thank you so much. This has just been such a lovely little journey. We're going to have to come to an end, though, with the final theme, which is the conclusion. So we have spoken about such a wealth of topics, a wealth of information. There's so many learnings, I think, out of that. And, you know, one of the reasons why I love doing this as well is because I get to ask questions to people who don't ordinarily get these questions asked to them, but then I get to hear the answers. And that's what I think the value of this podcast is. But what I really love about this section is the reflecting part of it for you as the person who shared it all. So I wonder, as you think about everything that we've discussed over the recording of this podcast, is there a particular insight or moment that stands out to you as especially meaningful or impactful?
So thinking about the conversation that we've had, Chris, looking at all of the things that we've talked about, the theme that I think runs through it, which I can see looking back on it, is really about honesty, and mostly about being honest with yourself. And that's one of the things I don't always get right, but that I really try and do for myself. And that when things go wrong in organisations, that's the root cause really of what's going wrong, is that people have been either sort of gaslit or just through repeating have been put in a place where they're not really being honest with themselves about their work and about who they are anymore. And that creates underperforming organisations and problems. So I think when I look back on it, what I see about all of that is honesty, particularly that being honest with ourselves, which is the most difficult kind of honesty, I think.
And I guess thinking more kind of personally and directly. So now you're in a position, and sometimes, you know, in these podcasts, I talk with people and they haven't thought about an event that happened to them, you know, 20 years ago until now, or 10 years ago until now. And now we're all in such different places to where we were back then. Is there anything that we've spoken about today, or anything that's even come to mind in the run up to, or, you know, during this podcast, where you as Penny as the now in 2024 thinks of Penny in, you know, 2010, for example, and what was happening to you then you think differently about now, or you've got a new perspective on now?
Oh, that is a really difficult question. I am somebody that does quite a bit of reflection. I think one of the learnings to take away from that conversation and from looking back is that there isn't ever an end goal. And I think one of the things that when times have been tough that sort of kept me going is the idea of, if I get to this point, things will be easier. And I've always kept thinking, oh, if only I could just get to this, then I'll get a bit of headroom, then I'll get a bit of space, then things will get a bit easier. And what I've come to learn is that there isn't going to be an end point like that is not what life is about. That, you know, even if you think about your your family, you think, okay, well, the kids will grow up, and then, okay, I might have to have some sad empty nester syndrome, but then at least this bit that I'm doing now, the driving them around everywhere, the paying for childcare, the being responsible for everything for them, that bit will come to an end. And then it doesn't, right? It definitely doesn't come to an end. And in my case, it's not come to an end because my daughter's had a baby, so now I'm supporting them. But for many people in many different ways, that doesn't really kind of come to an end. And it's the same with everything in life. Things change, but you don't get that, like, oh, when I've got enough money or when this occurs, everything is going to be easy. It doesn't really go like that. That you just have to keep swimming, like Dory says. Nemo, just keep swimming, and things will change, and you will get different challenges, and some areas of your life will feel really settled and you'll feel in charge of them, and then other areas of your life will feel a bit more all over the shop, and that is what we're all going through all of the time. We just don't see that part of everybody else, and it's not that there is this kind of dream plateau out there for us that we just need to find, and even people I know, somebody that sold a tech company for tens of millions of dollars, right? And he doesn't feel like that. He's not at a point where his life is all settled because families and connections and the world that we're in just doesn't enable that. So yeah, that's the big thing to think about, I think, looking back.
I guess I wonder if there's a way that we can add to what you've just said in a way that has a rainbow at the end of it, kind of thing. The
rainbow is that everybody is in the same place. The rainbow is that actually, would you even want that, right? The idea of getting to a point where everything in your life is sorted. But then what would you do? Then what would be the point of you? It's an easy thing to aspire to when life feels hard. But then you reach that point and you'd find there is no life. And I think when people say that sometimes being a celebrity or winning the lottery makes you unhappy, I think that's where that unhappiness comes from, of the pointlessness of, well, now I've done everything and I've helped everybody and I have no reason, what's my value anymore, right? And so I think that the struggle of life is the joy of life, and we are all struggling on different fronts all of the time, but that's the point. That is the point of being alive. That is the point of being who we are. And that's where we need to find the joy in those everyday things and our growth. And that's the rainbow, is that there isn't an end point. It is now. And it is, we all have difficult days, but the good that we can milk out of each day, that's the good.
And I think one of the lovely things that's really the thread that I think has pulled through everything that we've spoken about, and I think you said specifically once, know thyself as an important part of being in general. And it feels to me like the ability to make a positive influence and impact wherever you are is something that maybe fulfills you. And so even though you're going through these challenges, whatever they're personal, professional, and supporting people through them, maybe it's fulfilling for you to help those people through it whilst also being excellent at your role as well. So maybe that's also something that we can take away, or certainly that's something that I'm taking away from the conversation with you today, is that there's a lot of value into what you're putting out, and that seems to be something that fulfills you. Would you agree with that?
I do. I definitely do, Chris. It's about those small steps that we take every day. It's not, you don't need to be as rich as Jeff Bezos or running a company like Elon Musk. Those are not aspirations to go after. It's those everyday aspirations of helping a customer, of making somebody's day easier, of cooking dinner for your kids or whatever. My little niece on Christmas Day was like, everything on my plate is what I love. I think if we look at children and the way that they're able to enjoy, even my granddaughter loves looking at the wind in the trees, right? And we move so far away from that. And I'm not saying I'm sort of some Zen Buddhist and that we should all take joy from looking at the trees or anything, but I think that the real joy and real value in life does come from these small everyday interactions. When you make that cup of tea that's just perfect rather than okay, those are the things that are really good. But what we want, those mountains that we look at as when I'm there it will be all okay, those are kind of false, because actually even when you get to some of those, they're not what you think they're going to be, and that's the positive, I think.
Thank you for joining us on this episode of the Mentor Collective podcast. If you enjoyed it, you're welcome to subscribe. You're also welcome to go to our website, thementorcollective.net, to find out about the other good work we do in mentorship. Wherever you are, I hope you have a great rest of your day.